The sky above is an impenetrable gray, as if the heavens themselves are about to fall. The rain hits the ground with a force that turns the earth into mud, swallowing everything in its path. The air is thick, heavy with the weight of impending disaster. In the distance, a river that was once calm is now an angry torrent, its waters rising faster than anyone could have predicted. Amidst this chaos there's a lone figure, a dog stuck on a small patch of land. His eyes are wide with terror, his fur matted with rain. His body shivers not just from the cold but from the fear that tightens his chest like an iron band. The river churns, its waters gurgling and rushing with such intensity that it's hard to imagine it ever was anything but a violent beast. And yet, this dog remains, trapped, the distance between him and safety slowly shrinking with every passing second. His rescuer is barely visible against the darkening backdrop. A woman, drenched, her breath ragged, pushes forward against the wind. The air crackles with tension, the sound of water, of survival, of desperation. Every movement she makes seems to be battling the elements, every step a gamble. She can hear his whimpering from afar, and with each sob, her heart breaks a little more. Time is running out. She's not sure if she's strong enough, if the water will give her the mercy of a second chance. Show your love, hit like, share, and subscribe for more. The storm hit the small town like a freight train, rumbling across the sky with a ferocity that had been building for days. It started with a few drops, almost playful at first, as if nature itself were teasing the earth. But then the heavens seemed to snap, and the rain came down in sheets, so thick it almost blotted out the horizon. The wind howled through the trees, bending them at unnatural angles as the streets began to flood. People hurried to shelter, windows were slammed shut, and the usual hum of daily life was replaced with the deafening roar of nature's fury. Max, a street, smart pup who had lived through more than his fair share of hardships, knew the weather was bad. He'd been around long enough to sense when trouble was brewing, and this was trouble. But Max was used to trouble, used to the kind of uncertainty that made every day a struggle for survival. His usual spot, the alley between two crumbling buildings, wasn't safe anymore. The water started to rise slowly, trickling through the cracks in the concrete, seeping into the earth. At first it didn't seem too bad. Max had weathered storms before, but this was different. The rain kept coming, and the water kept rising, creeping higher and higher, faster than he had ever seen before. Max, ever cautious, decided to seek refuge further away from the alley. He made his way toward the riverbank, where the water usually stayed calm, even in heavy rains. The river was a constant in Max's world, something he had learned to respect. But today it was different. The river was angry, foaming at the mouth as if it had grown tired of its normal routine. Max's instincts, honed through years of street survival, screamed at him to stay away, but the pull of higher ground, the small patch of land at the river's edge, felt like the only option. It was an uncertain place, but it was the only one he knew, the only one that might save him. By the time Max reached the bank, the river had already started to swell, and the water was beginning to rush in, cutting off his path back. The land was small, a mere sliver of safety in a world that was quickly being swallowed by water. Max tried to find a spot on the land to settle, but each time he moved the ground seemed to give way beneath his paws. The water was everywhere, churning, relentless, dark as ink. He was trapped. Max's chest tightened. The sound of the storm mixed with the rush of the water. His heart beat faster. The rain hit his fur in cold sheets, and his small body shivered, not from the cold but from the rising panic. He'd never been this helpless. Max wasn't used to feeling weak, but as the water started to climb higher, pushing him closer to the edge, the reality of the situation hit him. His paws slipped in the mud. He tried to scramble, but the river was too powerful, too determined to swallow him whole. In the distance, far away but faintly audible over the storm, Max heard a sound, a voice, calling. The voice was faint, but there was something in the tone that made Max's heart flutter, a spark of hope he hadn't felt in a long time. The voice wasn't his own. It wasn't the whisper of the wind or the howl of the storm. No, it was something else. Someone else. Someone who cared. Max's instincts fought against the fear. He barked once, twice, but the water had already risen to his belly. His whimpering grew louder as the river edged closer, creeping in with an unrelenting force. The voice, that distant sound, was gone now, drowned out by the roar of the storm. He was alone. No, that wasn't true. He wasn't alone, not entirely. The storm had brought him here. Yes, but it had also brought someone who would try to save him. As the water surged higher, Max knew the truth. His life, his survival, was no longer just in his own paws. It was in the hands of whoever was coming for him, whoever was out there in the storm, braving the elements to reach him. He couldn't do this alone anymore. He was too small, too weak to fight the river on his own. He needed help, and for the first time in his life, he realized that maybe there was someone out there willing to offer it. The storm's ferocity continued, as if the world itself had been plunged into a battle between sky and earth. Streets that had once been bustling with life were now deserted, with only the occasional flicker of light from a window revealing that someone was still there, holding their breath. The rain wasn't just falling anymore. It was slashing down, the sound of it battering rooftops, windows, and the very air itself. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the branches as they bent beneath its pressure. The world had transformed into a violent dance of nature's forces. In the midst of this chaos, Rachel sat at her desk, a stack of paperwork in front of her, though her mind wasn't focused on the forms or the numbers. She could feel it in her gut. The storm was different this time. It wasn't just rain. It was something more, something that seemed to hold a promise of danger. The radio had already announced the flooding, a warning that felt more like a threat than a precaution. Rachel, who had spent most of her life in the town, had seen storms like this before. They were always bad, but this one felt different. She tried to shake off the uneasy feeling that gnawed at her, but it wouldn't leave. She pushed the stack of papers aside, standing up to stretch her stiff legs. A quick glance out the window told her everything she needed to know. The river was rising, fast. The low-lying streets were already turning into lakes, the water creeping in with alarming speed. But it was the call that did it. It was the call that cut through the growing panic in her chest and drove her to move. "Rachel, it's Max." The voice on the other end of the line said, gasping for breath. It was Dan, the animal shelter volunteer she had worked with for years. His voice was tight, filled with urgency. "He's stuck by the river. The water's rising fast. We can't get to him. The roads are flooded and I don't think we can get a boat in time. You have to hurry." The words hit Rachel like a thunderclap. Max. She knew the dog well. He was a regular at the shelter, a small scruffy pup who had lived on the streets for the first few months of his life before being rescued. Max had come to the shelter after a particularly harsh winter, cold and hungry, but with a resilience that made him stand out. Rachel had always admired his spirit. Max was a fighter, a survivor. But today, the river was bigger than he was. The floodwaters weren't just threatening him, they were swallowing everything in their path, and now they were closing in on Max. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. She didn't have time to waste. She could feel the panic bubbling in her chest, but there was no room for fear. Max was out there, alone. She had to be the one to save him. She grabbed her raincoat and threw it over her shoulders, not even bothering to take a second to think about the dangerous conditions. The clock was ticking. Every moment that passed meant the river would claim more of the land, and with it, Max's chance of survival. She shoved her phone into her pocket, knowing she had no time to waste, and bolted out of the door. The air hit her like a slap in the face. The wind was biting, forcing her to lean into it as she made her way down the street. The rain was relentless, soaking through her clothes in seconds, but the cold didn't matter. What mattered was getting to Max. The thought of him, struggling alone in the rising water, drove her forward with a single-minded determination. The streets were almost unrecognizable, water sloshing over curbs, cars abandoned and stalled. Rachel pushed through it all, her mind focused only on the dog who needed her. The floodwaters were rising faster than she had anticipated. By the time she reached the outskirts of town, where the riverbank lay, she was already waist-deep in water. Her boots sank into the mud with every step, and the wind threatened to knock her off balance. But she kept moving, the call for Max echoing in her mind. "I'm coming, Max. Hold on," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible above the storm's howl. When she finally reached the riverbank, she could see him. Max was barely visible against the churning mass of water, his small body barely clinging to a rock at the edge of the bank. His fur was matted with rain, his eyes wide with fear. He looked up as she approached, and for a brief moment, their gazes locked. His eyes seemed to say everything Rachel needed to know: "I need you." But the water was too high now, too dangerous. The river, which was usually a calm and serene body of water, had turned into a roaring beast, its current swift and powerful. Rachel could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins as she took in the situation. She was standing at the edge, just a few feet from Max, but there was no easy way across. The bank had become slippery, and the current was growing stronger by the minute. Rachel's heart raced as she scanned the area. There had to be a way to reach him. She knew that the water was rising quickly, and time was running out. She stepped forward, the mud sucking at her boots, and reached for a nearby tree branch to steady herself. The wind howled around her, the storm's rage intensifying. With every second, the gap between her and Max grew smaller, the distance feeling like an eternity. But she couldn't turn back now, she had to push forward. Max let out a soft whimper, and Rachel's resolve hardened. She could see the fear in his eyes, but there was something else too, a flicker of hope. He wasn't giving up, and neither would she. She could hear the rushing water getting louder, closer, but she took a deep breath and waded into the river. Each step was a battle, but she was moving toward him, toward the one thing that mattered. Max was waiting, and she couldn't fail him. Max's world had shrunk down to the relentless roar of the river. It was all-consuming, the sound of the rushing water filling his ears as he fought to keep his footing. His paws slipped in the mud, and each wave that crashed against him seemed to push him further into the depths of the river's fury. The water was cold, so cold it seemed to bite at his skin, sinking into his bones, leaving him numb. His small body trembled, not just from the cold, but from the deep, primal fear that churned in his chest. The river was stronger than he was. There was no way out. He was trapped. Max had survived many things in his life. The streets had taught him to be quick, to be smart, to trust no one. But this was different. This wasn't a fight with another stray over food or territory. This wasn't a narrow alleyway where he could dart between shadows to escape danger. This was the river, and it was closing in on him, swallowing the land he had once found safety in. He tried to scramble to find solid ground beneath his paws, but the water was everywhere. The surface was too slippery, the river too powerful. Every movement he made seemed to be swallowed by the current. Max's heart raced and his breathing grew shallow as the water rose higher, lapping at his chest, pushing him further from the edge of the bank. The small patch of land that had once been his refuge was now disappearing, inch by inch, into the greedy depths. The storm continued to batter him, each gust of wind hitting him with a force that made his fur stick to his body like wet paper. His eyes were wide, his muscles frozen, and yet, somewhere deep inside, there was a flicker of something else, an instinct to survive. Max had always been a survivor, always fought for another day. But today, that feeling seemed distant. His limbs felt heavy, and the weight of the river pressing in on him felt like more than he could bear. For a moment, he wasn't sure if he could keep going. His gaze, locked on the rising water, shifted toward the trees that lined the riverbank. There was no one there. The world around him felt like a strange, quiet place muffled by the sound of the storm. His tail, once held high with pride, was tucked under his body now, his head lowered in defeat. He was small, and the world was too big for him to fight. His little body trembled violently as the water reached up to his neck, and he wondered if this was how it would end. The storm was not just a force of nature. It was a reminder that sometimes survival wasn't enough. And yet, in that moment, Max's mind drifted to a memory, his first day at the shelter. The warmth of the human hands that had scooped him up, the soft bedding that smelled like comfort. He had been afraid then, too. Afraid of a world he didn't understand, of a future that felt uncertain. But someone had reached out, had taken him in. And in that brief, fleeting moment of warmth, he had realized something: he wasn't alone. Max snapped back to the present as the water surged higher. His body was pulled closer to the edge of the river, and the roar of the water grew louder, drowning out everything but the current that now seemed to take control of his every movement. He whined softly, unsure if anyone could hear him over the storm. But then, through the chaos, there was a sound, something different. A voice. It wasn't just the wind nor the crash of the waves. No, it was a human voice, a voice calling his name. His ears perked up at the sound, and for a brief moment he froze. Was he imagining it? Was it just the wind? He turned his head toward the direction the voice had come from. There, barely visible through the sheets of rain and the swirling mist, was a figure. A woman, small but determined, her silhouette barely visible against the dark backdrop of the storm. Max's heart skipped a beat. The voice, the figure, it was real. Someone was coming for him. Someone cared. He whined again, this time louder, the desperation in his voice unmistakable. He wanted to move, to get to her, but his body felt like it was made of stone. The water pulled at him, the current a constant reminder of how small and powerless he was. The woman's voice came again, clearer this time, cutting through the chaos of the storm.
Max, hold on! I'm coming for you!
The words hit him like a jolt of electricity. She was coming for him. She hadn't forgotten about him. She wasn't just going to leave him here alone in the storm. The realization sparked something in Max, something deep inside that he hadn't felt in so long. Hope. It was faint at first, like a flickering candle in a storm, but it grew brighter as he locked eyes with the woman through the rain. He could see her now, pushing through the water, her movements steady despite the wind and the waves. Max's breathing became a little less frantic, a little less shallow. He could feel her presence, even though she was still too far away. But she was coming, and that was enough. The bond between them, however small it had been, was enough to give him strength. Max took a shaky step forward, his body swaying with the current, but he couldn't stop now. The woman was getting closer. He could hear her, her footsteps in the water, her voice reaching him through the storm. Her determination called out to him, louder than the thunder above. He wasn't alone. He didn't have to fight this battle by himself. Someone was coming for him. The storm had brought them together, but it was also pulling them apart. Max's world seemed to be closing in, but he knew that she was the key to his survival. As the water continued to rise, so too did the hope inside of him, building with every inch she came closer. Her voice, now sharp with urgency, reached him once again. Max, don't give up. And for the first time, Max felt something different. He didn't have to. He didn't have to face the river alone anymore. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as she waded deeper into the river, the water now pushing at her waist. Each step felt like a battle. The current was fierce, strong enough to make her legs tremble, but she didn't dare stop. Not now. Not when Max was just within reach, so close but still so far away. The rain lashed at her face, stinging her skin with the force of 1,000 needles. The wind screamed through the trees, bending them as if the world itself were trying to pull her back. But she didn't listen. She couldn't. Max's desperate whimpers echoed through the storm, each cry a sharp reminder of how much time was slipping away. The river had already claimed more than half of the small patch of land he had clung to. The water churned violently, dark and unforgiving, threatening to pull him under at any moment. Rachel's heart ached as she saw the fear in his eyes, the trembling of his small body as he fought against the current. She had seen him before at the shelter, so full of life, a small ball of energy who had captured everyone's hearts. But now he was alone, helpless in the face of nature's fury. She knew she had to move faster, but each step was a struggle. Her boots sank into the mud, the water tugging at her legs as she pushed forward. It felt as if the river itself were trying to drag her down, to pull her into its depths. The more she fought, the more the current seemed determined to pull her under. But Rachel didn't let herself think about that. She couldn't. The only thing that mattered was getting to Max. She reached for a branch hanging from a nearby tree, using it to steady herself as the water continued to rise around her. The world felt distant, muffled by the storm and the roar of the river, her vision blurred by the rain, but she could still see Max, his wide, fearful eyes locked on hers. There was no mistaking the recognition there. He knew her, and for a brief moment she saw something else in his eyes, hope. Hope that she could save him, that she wasn't just another passerby who would turn away when things got too difficult. Max needed her, and in that moment, Rachel knew she needed him just as much.
Hang on, Max!
Rachel called, her voice barely audible above the wind and the thunder. She could see him trying to move, his legs struggling to stay planted against the current. But the water was pulling him inch by inch, closer to the edge. His small body trembled, his fur slick against his skin, but he made no move to flee. He was too weak, too scared. He was waiting for her. Rachel's body ached as she moved forward, the cold water soaking through her clothes, but the fire inside her kept her going. She was almost there. She could see the rock Max was clinging to, his paws barely keeping him grounded against the relentless force of the river. The water surged around him, rising faster now, but Rachel wouldn't let it take him. She couldn't.
Max, I'm right here!
Rachel called again, reaching her hand out toward him. She could see him try to lift his head, his eyes locked on her. But it wasn't enough. The water continued to rise and Max's small body struggled to hold on. His legs were shaking, his muscles fatigued from fighting against the current for so long. He needed help. He couldn't hold on much longer. The current was pushing her forward faster than she expected, but the distance between them still felt like a chasm. Her legs were heavy with the weight of the water, and the rushing stream tried to pull her off balance. Her arms reached for Max, but she couldn't reach him yet. She was so close, but the water seemed to be fighting her every step of the way. Max let out a low, desperate whimper, the sound carrying through the wind. He was barely holding on now, his grip slipping on the rock. Every second mattered. Every second brought him closer to the edge of the river, to the point where he could no longer fight the current. Rachel felt her chest tighten as the realization hit her. If she didn't get to him now, if she didn't act fast, he would be lost to the river. Without thinking, Rachel lunged forward, her arm outstretched toward Max. She could feel her heart pounding in her throat, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she pushed herself further into the water. The current pulled at her legs, threatening to knock her off balance, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. In one swift motion, Rachel reached Max, her fingers brushing against his wet fur. His body was shivering, his small form trembling in her arms as she gripped him tightly. He let out a weak bark, as if to say, "I'm here, I'm ready, please don't leave me." Rachel didn't hesitate. She pulled him close to her chest, her arms wrapped securely around his fragile body, and she began to move back toward the shore. The water surged higher, but Rachel held on tight. Max's small body shook in her arms, but his breathing began to steady as she moved through the river. Every step felt like an eternity, the weight of the water pulling at her, threatening to drag her down, but she refused to stop. She had him now. She couldn't let go. With one final push, Rachel reached the edge of the river, her feet finding solid ground as she stumbled onto the bank. Max, still trembling in her arms, was safe. They had made it. The storm still raged around them, but they were no longer in the river. The battle was over. Rachel collapsed to the ground, her body shaking from exhaustion, but her heart felt lighter than it had in hours. Max was safe. His small wet body pressed against hers, his breathing slow but steady. She felt his warmth against her skin. And for a moment, all the pain, all the fear seemed to disappear. "You're okay," Rachel whispered, her voice breaking as she held him close. "You're safe now." Max's tail gave a faint, shaky wag, as if he, too, realized they had made it through the worst. In that moment, the world seemed to quiet around them. The storm was still there, still roaring in the distance, but for Rachel and Max, everything else had faded away. They were safe. They had made it through the storm together. Rachel's breath came in shallow gasps as she stood on the muddy bank, her body trembling with the shock of the cold, the exertion of the fight against the river. She glanced down at Max, whose small, damp body was pressed against her chest, still shaking but alive. The storm hadn't let up, the wind howling through the trees, rain pelting them relentlessly. But in that moment, it didn't matter. The storm felt distant, irrelevant in the face of what they had just overcome. Max's head rested on her lap, his eyes half closed in exhaustion, but he was no longer whimpering in fear. His body shuddered every now and then, as if reminding her that they were both still caught in the aftermath of the chaos. Rachel's own limbs felt like lead, her muscles aching from the effort of holding onto him, from pushing forward through the freezing water. She wasn't sure how long they had been in the river, struggling against the current, but it felt like an eternity. The ground beneath her felt firm at least. The mud was thick, making it hard to move, but it was safe. She could breathe. She could finally stop moving and catch her breath. For a moment the world seemed to hold still, the sound of the storm fading into the background. But as she looked down at Max, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The storm wasn't over yet, and the fight wasn't finished. She still had to get them to safety. Max lifted his head slightly, his eyes meeting hers, and in that instant, something shifted. There was a connection there, something raw and unspoken. Rachel felt it deep in her bones. This wasn't just about her rescuing Max anymore, it was about something much bigger. He had fought to survive just like she had, and now, they were in this together. The bond between them, forged in the fire of the storm, felt like it could never be broken. But the river, the storm, it was still there. The rain showed no sign of stopping, and the floodwaters were still rising inch by inch. Rachel glanced toward the horizon. The world around them seemed to be dissolving into a blur of gray, but she knew they couldn't stay here. The longer they remained on this bank, the more the flood would threaten to swallow them whole. She had to get Max to shelter. She had to find safety not just for him, but for herself as well. "Come on, Max," she murmured softly, brushing her hand over his wet fur. He lifted his head slightly, his eyes still heavy with exhaustion but filled with trust. He didn't fight her when she gently coaxed him onto his feet. His small, trembling body leaned against hers for support, but Rachel could feel the faint warmth of his body, the rhythm of his breathing, and the spark of life within him. He was alive. They had made it through the worst of it. But there was no time for celebration. The river was still rising, and the storm still raged on. They were alive, yes, but they were far from out of danger. Rachel's gaze swept over the surroundings again. The land was barren, the trees bent under the force of the wind, the river still churning violently in the distance. The shoreline they had stumbled onto was now an island in the flood, surrounded by dark water that stretched on for what seemed like miles. Rachel knew they had to move. The floodwaters weren't just rising slowly anymore. The current was becoming stronger, sweeping across the land with an intensity that made her heart race. She could see the river edge creeping closer, the water that had once seemed far away now lapping dangerously at their feet. She could hear it too, the sound of it rushing, thundering like an unstoppable beast, and the echoes of that sound filled her chest with dread. Max leaned heavily against her as they began to move, the both of them struggling against the water that had no intention of letting them go. The rain soaked them through to the bone, but they couldn't stop. Every step was a fight, the current pushing them backward with every inch they gained. Rachel gritted her teeth, every muscle in her body screaming in protest as she held Max close, trying to shield him from the worst of the storm. But even that small comfort seemed futile against the power of the flood. Max's paws slipped in the mud as they pushed forward, his small body trying desperately to keep up with Rachel's hurried pace. She could feel his body quivering, could feel the fear in his trembling limbs, but he didn't pull away. He didn't try to run or hide. He stayed close, trusting her completely, just as she trusted him. They were partners now, not just rescuer and rescued. They were two beings fighting against the storm together. Every few steps Rachel's feet would sink deep into the mud, and the water would try to pull her back, but she fought through it. Her eyes locked on the far-off line of trees that signaled the edge of the floodplain. That was where they had to go, where they could find higher ground, where they could wait out the storm. The wind howled in her ears, and the rain came down in sheets, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't think about anything other than getting them to safety. Max let out a low, pained whimper as the water surged around them, and Rachel's grip tightened on his fragile body. She could feel his small form trembling against her, his breath shallow and ragged, but he kept moving. He kept going. They were so close. She could see the trees now, the safety of the woods just ahead. They had made it this far. They could make it the rest of the way. But then, just as they neared the trees, a sudden wave of water crashed against Rachel's legs, knocking her off balance. The current swept beneath her feet, and for a moment, she felt herself being pulled under. Max let out a desperate cry as she stumbled, but Rachel managed to regain her footing just in time, clutching him tightly to her chest. The water swirled violently around them, pushing and pulling with an unforgiving strength, but Rachel held on. She held on because she had no other choice. Through the water, through the storm, she pushed forward. The trees were so close now, she could almost reach them. One more step, one more. Finally, with one last push, she reached the safety of the higher ground. The trees loomed above them, offering some shelter from the worst of the storm. Max, exhausted and shaken, collapsed into her arms, his body still trembling. Rachel sank to her knees, her own body shaking from the strain of the journey. But she couldn't stop. Not yet. The storm was still raging, but they were safe, at least for now. They had fought against the current, and they had won. Together. The storm showed no signs of easing. The rain continued to lash down in relentless sheets, and the wind screamed through the trees, bending them like frail reeds. The ground was saturated, the earth slick and treacherous underfoot. Rachel sat against the trunk of a large oak tree, her breath ragged as she held Max tightly in her arms. The small dog had stopped trembling, though he still looked worn out, his eyes dull with exhaustion. His tiny body was pressed close to hers, and she could feel his shallow breath against her chest. For a moment, Rachel simply sat there, unable to do anything but hold him. The storm still raged, but in this small pocket of shelter under the tree, they were safe. For now, at least. The sound of the river was still audible in the distance, but it had become a faint roar in the background. Max was no longer struggling against the water, he was resting, the weight of everything finally catching up to him. Rachel's own body ached with fatigue. Her arms trembled from the effort of carrying Max through the floodwaters. Her clothes were soaked through, clinging to her skin like a second layer, and the cold was beginning to seep in, creeping into her bones. But none of that mattered, not right now. What mattered was Max, who had been through far worse than she could ever imagine, and had still managed to survive. She stroked his wet fur, her fingers running through the damp patches where the water had soaked him through. His small, fragile body felt so much lighter in her arms now that the adrenaline had worn off. It was almost as though he had become a part of her, as if the bond between them was now something solid, something real, forged in the fury of the storm. In his eyes, Rachel could see a reflection of herself. They were both battered, broken, but they were still here, and they would make it through this, together. Max let out a soft sigh, his body relaxing into her touch. But his gaze never left her face. It was as though he was waiting for something, some sign that they weren't completely alone in the world, that the worst had passed. Rachel couldn't promise him that. The river was still out there, still threatening, still pushing forward with a power she couldn't control. But she could offer him what he needed most right now: safety, warmth, and the knowledge that he wasn't alone anymore. For a few moments, there was only the sound of the rain, the steady patter of droplets falling onto the soaked earth. Rachel closed her eyes, allowing herself to rest for a brief moment. She could feel the weight of the world on her shoulders, the responsibility of keeping Max alive, of bringing him out of the river, of fighting against the elements that had threatened to take him. She hadn't realized how heavy that weight was until now. She had been so focused on surviving the storm, on getting Max to safety, that she hadn't allowed herself to feel the full extent of what she had done. Her chest tightened, her breath hitching as she thought about how close they had come to losing him. The moment she had reached for him in the water, feeling his small body trembling in her arms, was burned into her memory. The fear in his eyes, the helplessness he must have felt as the current dragged him closer to the river's edge. But she had made it in time. She had saved him. They had fought the current together, and they had both made it to safety. But the storm was still here. The floodwaters were still rising, and she couldn't let her guard down yet. Rachel stood up slowly, adjusting her hold on Max, who seemed to sense her determination. He stirred slightly, lifting his head to look at her. His eyes were still heavy, still clouded with exhaustion, but there was something in them that told her he was ready. He was ready to keep going. Rachel took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around his small body. She couldn't stay here forever. This temporary shelter under the oak tree was just that, temporary. She had to get them out of the storm. She had to find a way to get them both to safety. She glanced around, the sound of the river growing louder as the floodwaters crept closer. She could see the land was starting to disappear again, the river's edge inching forward, threatening to reclaim what little they had gained. The thought of moving again, of having to face the water once more, made Rachel's stomach churn with dread, but she couldn't hesitate. Max's small whine pulled her from her thoughts. She looked down at him, and his eyes met hers. There was no fear in them now, only the raw, quiet trust that had formed between them in the last few hours. The fear had been replaced by something deeper, a shared understanding of what they had just gone through, of how close they had come to being lost to the storm. Rachel bent down and gently placed Max on the ground, her hands trembling from both the cold and the weight of everything that had happened. Max staggered slightly, but he quickly regained his footing, his small body swaying as he tried to steady himself. Rachel watched him carefully, her heart pounding. He was weak, no doubt about that, but he was still moving, still fighting. She took another deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. There was no time to waste. They had to keep moving. She couldn't let the storm win. Rachel held out her hand to Max, a silent invitation for him to follow. He lifted his head, his ears perked slightly as if sensing the change in her tone, in her body language. He hesitated for a moment before he walked toward her, his legs unsteady but determined. With Max by her side, Rachel moved forward. The path ahead was uncertain and the storm still howled, but she refused to let that stop her. She had come this far. She had kept him alive through the worst of the storm. Now all she had to do was make sure they reached safety. And she would. For him. For both of them. Every step Rachel took felt like wading through quicksand. The ground beneath her feet was unstable, the mud heavy with water, and her legs ached with the strain of the journey. Max, still weak but pushing on with every step, stumbled beside her, his small body shaking with exhaustion. He was trying so hard to keep up with her. But the weight of the storm and the floodwater had taken a toll on him. Rachel could feel it with every step, the weight of his body against her side, the slight tremble in his legs as he moved forward. The wind howled around them, tugging at their clothes and making the world feel like it was spinning out of control. The rain, relentless as ever, pelted down from above, soaking them through to their bones. The floodwaters were still rising, though not as quickly now. The worst of the storm had passed, but the river was still swollen, a force of nature that wouldn't let them go without a fight. Rachel's heart raced as she scanned the horizon, looking for the safety of the high ground that she knew must be nearby. She had no idea how much further they had to go, but every moment felt like a gamble. The storm had left everything in chaos. What was once familiar land had become a treacherous labyrinth of rising water, debris, and the distant roar of the river that seemed to chase them with every step they took. Max's breathing was slow, labored. His steps faltered, and Rachel felt a pang of panic deep in her chest. He was struggling. She could see it in the way his body swayed, in the way his head drooped. Max had fought so hard to survive the river, to survive the storm. But the toll it had taken on him was becoming too much to bear. Just a little longer, Max, Rachel whispered, her voice hoarse. But she didn't know if he could hear her over the deafening roar of the storm. She reached down, her fingers brushing through his wet fur, offering him what little comfort she could. "We're almost there. You're going to make it." But the current wasn't finished with them yet. A sudden surge of water rose up, pulling at their feet, threatening to knock them off balance. Rachel's heart stopped for a split second as she felt her footing slip. The flood had turned the earth beneath them into slippery mud, and it was only by sheer force of will that she was able to catch herself. She gripped Max tightly in her arms, holding him close to her chest as she fought against the pull of the water. Max's small body was limp in her arms, his head resting against her shoulder, but his eyes, those eyes that had looked at her with so much trust, so much gratitude, were open, filled with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. Rachel's chest tightened at the sight. He was still here, still alive, but she knew she couldn't wait any longer. They had to get to higher ground. With one final surge of energy, Rachel pushed forward, her feet slipping but her resolve unbroken. The trees ahead were closer now, the promise of safety almost within her reach. The water surged around them again, pushing harder, but Rachel's determination only grew stronger. She had made it this far. She wouldn't, let the storm take them now. Max let out a soft whimper, his voice barely audible over the wind. It was a sound that pierced Rachel's heart, a sound that told her he was reaching the end of his strength. He was giving everything he had to stay with her, to keep moving, but she could see it in his eyes. He was fading. The battle he had fought so long to survive was wearing him down. "Max," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. "You've been so brave, so strong. Just hold on." She could feel him trying to stay awake, his small body trembling with each step. He was fighting to stay with her. She could see the effort it took for him to lift his paws, to keep moving forward, even when his body wanted to give up. His spirit was still alive, still fighting, but Rachel knew that the strain on him was taking its toll. The trees were only a few feet away now. They could make it. Rachel could feel the ground beneath her feet shifting, the muddy earth starting to give way to more solid terrain. But then, another surge of water came, this time stronger than before, knocking her off balance. She stumbled forward, her heart racing as she felt herself begin to slip. The water was relentless, the current pushing against her with the force of everything it had. Max yelped, a high-pitched cry that tore at Rachel's heart. She turned quickly, her eyes searching for him. Max was being pulled by the current, his small body dragged away from her. The force of the water was too much for him. Rachel's chest constricted as she reached for him, her arms outstretched. But the current was moving too fast. Max was too far away. "No!" Rachel screamed, her voice breaking. She reached out again, desperate, but Max was carried farther away with each passing second. Her heart seemed to stop in her chest as she watched helplessly, the tears already mixing with the rain that fell relentlessly around them. But Max wasn't gone. Not yet. Not while Rachel still had breath in her body. With everything she had left, Rachel lunged toward him, her arms stretching, her legs barely able to hold her up. The water was almost at her chest now, the current pushing harder than ever. She could feel the strength draining from her, but she wouldn't stop. She couldn't. Max needed her. Her fingertips brushed against the wet fur of his back, and she grabbed him, pulling him into her arms with a strength she didn't know she had left. The current fought against her, trying to tear him from her grasp, but she held on tight, holding him against her chest as she struggled to stay on her feet. Max let out another faint whimper, but this time it wasn't the whimper of fear. It was a soft, exhausted sound, as if he were giving in, trusting her completely. Rachel's breath was ragged, her hands numb from the cold, but she held him tightly, lifting him in her arms as she began to move again. With every ounce of strength she had left, Rachel pushed forward inch by inch. She didn't know how much longer she could keep going, but she wasn't going to stop. Not now, not when Max was still in her arms. The shore was within reach. It was close now, and finally, after what felt like an eternity, Rachel and Max reached solid ground again. She collapsed to her knees, holding Max against her chest, her body shaking with the effort of the fight. But they were safe. They had made it. They had survived. The storm had finally begun to loosen its grip, the last vestiges of the howling wind dying down into a distant murmur. The rain still fell, but more gently now, a soft patter against the leaves of the trees that provided a faint sense of shelter. Rachel collapsed against the tree she had struggled to reach, her arms wrapped around Max. Her breath ragged and uneven. Her body trembled, not just from the cold but from the sheer weight of what they had just endured. The floodwaters had stolen everything. Her sense of safety, her sense of time, and the stillness that had once seemed like an absolute given. But now, in the eye of the storm's aftermath, everything felt different. Max was still in her arms, his small body still, the rise and fall of his chest slow but steady. His fur, once matted with rain and river water, was now a damp mess, but he was alive. He was here with her, and that simple fact carried more weight than anything else in the world. Rachel pressed her forehead to Max's, closing her eyes for a moment. Her chest was tight, and though she was no longer moving through the storm, the adrenaline coursing through her body didn't seem to leave. She could still feel the fight within her, the strain of the water, the tug of the current, the fear in her chest that had surged with every step she had taken toward him. And in that fear, in that fight, there had been something else. A resolve, a strength, a bond forged in the fire of survival. Max had survived. She had survived. But now the storm had passed. The earth was quiet. The river's roar had become a distant murmur. Rachel allowed herself a breath, a long, slow inhale that filled her lungs. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of rain-soaked earth and wet leaves. The world around her felt still. The chaos, the panic, the rush to save him, to save them both, had given way to a fragile peace. Max shifted in her arms, his small body still weak but less frantic now, no longer trembling in the same desperate way. His body felt warmer against hers, the cold that had gripped them both beginning to ease. She held him close, her hand resting gently on his back. The sense of relief washed over her in waves. They had made it. They had survived the storm. And now they just needed to breathe, to rest. The next few moments passed in quiet serenity. Rachel looked around, taking in the scene. The floodwaters had begun to recede, but the ground was still soaked, the trees around them dripping with the remnants of the storm. The sky above was still thick with clouds, but there was a faint, almost imperceptible light beginning to break through. The storm had passed, but the scars it left behind were undeniable. The river had taken more than it should, but it hadn't taken everything. It hadn't taken Max. And for that, Rachel felt a deep, unshakable gratitude. Max whimpered softly, his eyes fluttering open, his small face still wet with rain. But he was looking at her now, his gaze steady, searching her face for something. For reassurance. For confirmation that it was all over. Rachel smiled softly, brushing a hand through his fur, her voice gentle. "You're safe, Max," she whispered. "You're safe now." Max let out a soft sigh, as if the weight of the past few hours were finally catching up to him. He shifted a little, curling up closer to her as if seeking warmth, seeking comfort. Rachel wrapped her arms around him, pulling him into her lap, her hands trembling as she gently ran her fingers through his wet fur. In the silence that followed, she let herself breathe, let the relief wash over her. The storm had passed. The worst was behind them. And though they were both exhausted, both physically drained by the battle they had fought against the river, they had made it. They had found safety, together. The world around them was still drenched, the ground soggy with the remnants of the storm. But there was a stillness in the air now, a calm that seemed almost too perfect after the chaos. Rachel lifted her head, her eyes scanning the horizon. The floodwaters were still high in places, but they weren't as threatening now. The danger had passed, for now at least. The storm had raged through their lives, but it had also brought something with it, a new beginning. Max was still weak, still recovering, but he was alive. And for Rachel, that was enough. For now, that was all she needed. She took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill her lungs. The ground was firm beneath her now. The trees, their branches still heavy with water, provided some shelter from the rain, and the world felt quieter, more still. She could hear the faint sound of the river, but it was no longer the roaring monster it had been earlier. It had calmed, as if the storm's rage had been spent. For the first time in hours, Rachel allowed herself to close her eyes, if only for a moment. She could feel Max's warmth against her chest, the gentle rise and fall of his breathing, the quiet rhythm that had become her anchor throughout the storm. And in that quiet moment, with the storm still rumbling in the distance, she realized something she hadn't before. They had both fought, and they had both survived, together. Max was no longer the small, helpless dog she had rescued from the river. He had fought with everything he had, and now he was here, with her. As Rachel sat there, Max nestled into her arms. She felt the weight of everything she had experienced with him. The struggle, the fear, the fight for survival, and realized how much she had changed in the process. It wasn't just about saving Max anymore. It was about everything they had endured together, about the trust they had built, the bond that had formed between them in the heat of battle. The storm had ended, but their story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Rachel looked down at Max, who was now sleeping peacefully in her arms, his small body rising and falling with each soft breath. She stroked his fur gently, her fingers brushing the damp patches where the water had soaked into him. The storm was gone, but they were here, together, and that was all that mattered now. As the last of the rain tapered off, Rachel smiled to herself, the weight of the world lifting from her shoulders. If only for a moment, she would keep him safe. She would always keep him safe. The storm had passed, and now there was nothing left but the quiet and the promise of tomorrow. As the rain finally eased into a soft drizzle, the world around them began to change. The storm, which had seemed so fierce just hours ago, now felt like a distant memory. The skies, heavy with the aftermath of the downpour, were beginning to show the first faint glimmers of light as the clouds parted ever so slightly. The distant rumble of thunder had faded, leaving only the subtle sound of dripping water from the trees. The air smelled fresh, wet earth mixed with the clean scent of rain, but there was something more, something deeper in the stillness of the moment, a sense of calm. Rachel sat still against the trunk of the oak tree, holding Max in her lap. His small body was still warm from the hours they had spent together, and his breathing, though slow and exhausted, was steady. Rachel looked down at him, her fingers gently brushing through his damp fur. He was finally at peace, and so was she. Max's small, trembling form had found solace in her arms. The fear of the river and the storm that had gripped him earlier now replaced by a sense of safety. He was tired, too tired to keep fighting, and as he lay curled up in her lap, Rachel felt the weight of his trust settle upon her. She wasn't just a stranger anymore. She wasn't just the person who had rescued him from the flood. She was something more. They had survived the storm together, and in the midst of that battle, a bond had formed between them, forged in the urgency of the fight and solidified in the quiet moments after. Rachel's heart swelled as she realized just how much Max had come to depend on her. She had been his lifeline in the darkest of moments, and in return, he had shown her the strength of a creature who would fight with everything he had to stay alive. The world felt small and quiet now. The floodwaters had receded from the surrounding areas, leaving behind a soggy, mud-soaked landscape. The trees stood tall, dripping water from their branches, and the ground was soft beneath Rachel's feet, still wet from the storm's fury. But there was something beautiful in the aftermath. The air felt lighter, the world more open, and the chaos of the river seemed a distant memory. Rachel smiled softly, looking down at Max, who was now breathing deeply, his small body relaxed against her. She didn't know how long they had been sitting there, in the quiet refuge of the oak tree, but it didn't matter. The storm had passed, the worst was over, and Max was safe. Rachel ran her hand gently along his back, feeling the warmth of his fur beneath her fingers. The bond between them felt so natural, as if it had always been there, waiting to unfold. She had been so focused on survival, on getting through the storm, that she hadn't allowed herself to think about what came next. But now, in this stillness, as the world began to heal around them, she could feel the weight of their connection settle into her heart. Max's eyes fluttered open, and for a brief moment, their gazes met. Rachel could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the remnants of the fear he had carried with him through the storm. But there was also something else there. Something deeper. It was the quiet recognition of shared survival, a bond forged in the fire of adversity. Rachel leaned down, her voice soft as she spoke to him. "We made it, Max," she whispered, her fingers gently stroking his fur. "You're safe now." Max didn't whimper or bark in response. He simply looked up at her, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. He trusted her now completely, and for Rachel that trust was a gift. She had been his savior, but in return, Max had become her anchor, her reason to keep going, even when the storm had seemed like too much to bear. The rain had stopped for now, but the world around them was still wet and heavy with the storm's residue. Rachel stood up slowly, carefully cradling Max in her arms. She could feel his body grow warm against her chest, his breathing slow and steady, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to breathe deeply. The weight of the storm, the fear, the exhaustion, everything that had weighed her down, began to lift just a little. Max stirred slightly in her arms, and Rachel looked down at him, her heart swelling with affection. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't going to leave him. They had fought the storm together, and now they would face whatever came next together. He wasn't just a dog she had saved from the flood. He had become something more, a companion, a partner, and perhaps even a friend. Rachel walked slowly, carefully, her boots sinking slightly into the damp earth as she moved toward the higher ground. The path was still wet and treacherous, but it was manageable now. The worst of the flood had passed, and though the water still lingered in places, the danger had faded with the storm. They had made it together, and as Rachel looked down at Max, she couldn't help but feel that they had both been saved in more ways than one. With each step she took, Rachel felt the weight of everything she had just endured lift from her shoulders. The fear, the panic, the uncertainty. It was all still there, but it wasn't as suffocating as it had been before. They had made it through the storm, and they had come out on the other side stronger for it. And Max, small and fragile as he was, had been her constant source of strength, reminding her of the power of trust, loyalty, and the quiet bond that had formed between them in the face of danger. As they moved further from the river, Rachel felt a new sense of purpose rise within her. The world around them was still recovering, but there was something beautiful in the stillness, something that spoke of new beginnings. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't facing it alone. Max was by her side, and together, they would rebuild, one step at a time. The storm had passed, the floodwaters had receded, and in the wake of it all, a bond had been forged between a woman and a dog, stronger than any storm that could ever come their way. The world was still heavy with the aftermath of the storm. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained overcast, a blanket of gray that seemed to linger, unwilling to give way to the light. The floodwaters had begun to recede, leaving behind muddy pools and the remnants of debris that the river had claimed. The trees, their leaves heavy with water, swayed gently in the breeze, but the ferocity of the storm had passed. What was left now was a world washed clean, its beauty hidden beneath the wetness and the mud. Rachel stood at the edge of the higher ground, her feet sinking slightly into the soaked earth, her arms still holding Max close to her chest. He was quiet now, his small body pressed against her with the weight of exhaustion. He had finally fallen into a deeper sleep, the kind that came after a battle. And for both of them, this was a battle that would never truly leave their memories. They had both endured something that would forever change them, something that had tested their limits, their strength, and their survival instincts. But now, In the quiet aftermath, they had made it, together. The world around them was different now. It had shifted. The storm had torn through their lives with a fury that was both humbling and terrifying, but it had also revealed something deeper. Rachel could feel the bond she had with Max growing stronger with each passing moment. The fear and chaos of the storm had given way to something else. A connection that went beyond survival. She wasn't just his rescuer. She wasn't just the woman who had pulled him from the floodwaters. She was his lifeline, and in return he had become her anchor. Max stirred slightly in her arms, his small body shifting as if trying to find a more comfortable position. Rachel gazed down at him, her heart swelling with affection. The storm had been brutal, and the fear they had both experienced still lingered in the air, but there was a new kind of peace settling in her chest. She had done it. They had done it. They had survived. As Rachel took another deep breath, she looked out across the land, the flooded fields now receding into puddles of water, the river now a quiet trickle in the distance. There was a sense of calm in the air, a quiet stillness that spoke of new beginnings. The storm had swept through, leaving destruction in its wake, but it had also given way to something else: hope. She took a step forward, her boots squelching in the soft earth beneath her feet, but she didn't mind. Each step felt like a small victory. She was no longer running away from the storm, she was moving forward. And for the first time in a long while, Rachel felt the weight of the world lift just a little. The fear, the uncertainty, all of it had receded like the floodwaters, and in its place, there was room for something new. Something that was born of survival, of resilience. Max's soft breathing was the only sound she could hear, the rhythm of his breath a comforting, steady reminder that he was still with her, that they were both still here. The storm had tested them, but it had also brought them closer. She wasn't sure what the future held, but as she looked down at Max, she knew she wouldn't face it alone. They had become partners in survival, and that partnership, forged in the storm's fury, was something that would never break. Rachel smiled softly, the weight of the world no longer pressing down on her. The worst was over. They had made it. Max's tiny body in her arms was proof of that. They had weathered the storm together, and now, as the sky slowly began to brighten, there was a sense of calm that settled over them both. They had faced the worst of it, and they had survived. But this was just the beginning. The storm had passed, but life was waiting for them on the other side. Rachel didn't know what that life would look like. But she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't facing it alone. She had Max by her side, and that made all the difference. As they continued forward, Rachel's steps slow and deliberate, she could see the horizon beginning to shift. The sky was still gray, but there was the promise of light in the distance, the first hint of dawn breaking through the clouds. The world was recovering, just like they were. The storm had come and gone, but now it was time for them to move forward. Together. The ground beneath them was wet, but with each step it felt firmer, less unstable. They were moving toward a new chapter, a new beginning, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Rachel allowed herself to hope. The storm was over. The floodwaters had receded, and now it was time for them to rebuild. Max lifted his head from her lap, his tired eyes meeting hers with a quiet, unspoken understanding. He was still weak, still recovering, but he was here. With her, they had survived, and now they would move forward. Together, Rachel took another step, feeling the weight of her determination settling into her bones. They had made it this far. And no matter what came next, no matter what challenges they would face, she knew they would face them together. The storm had passed. The river, once fierce and threatening, was now a quiet stream. The world was changing, and so were they. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: they would face it together. And that was all that mattered. As Rachel continued walking, the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, casting a soft golden light across the land. The world was waking up, and with it, so were they. The storm had passed, and now it was time for a new beginning.